Stanley Milgram, an American social psychologist at Yale University. The second of three children, Milgram was born in 1933 in New York to Jewish parents. Milgram's immediate and extended family was subject to the horrific crimes of the Second World War and the Holocaust that occurred. After the war, relatives that had survived had come to stay with Milgram and his family, bearing the experience of Nazi concentration camps and boring assigned tattoos. His bar mitzvah speech reflected his family's experiences and what the Second World War's effect would have on the Jewish people. As I find happiness in joining the ranks of Israel, the knowledge of the tragic suffering of my fellow Jews makes this an occasion to reflect upon the heritage of my people, which now becomes mine. I shall try to understand my people and do my best to share the responsibilities which history has placed upon all of us. His unarguable first-hand experience of being part of a family affected by the war led to his curiosity and investigation into obedience to authority, and serves as the genesis to what would be the Stanley Milgram experiment he would be recognized for. Milgram wanted to investigate whether Germans were particularly obedient to authority figures, as this was a common explanation for the Nazi killings in World War II, and also an argument during the case of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem. Eichmann's defense was that he was merely following instructions when he ordered the deaths of millions of Jews, and this captured Milgram's interest. Milgram wondered whether the claims of the banality of evil, that evil acts come from ordinary people following orders as they do their jobs, could be demonstrated in the lab. Were the Nazis evil people with natural traits for violence and cruelty, or were they merely just obeying orders? In 1961, Milgram placed an advertisement in the New Haven Register. "We will pay you $4 for 1 hour of your time," it read, asking for 500 New Haven men to help us complete a scientific study of memory and learning. Only part of that was true. Over the next 2 years, hundreds of people showed up at Milgram's lab for a learning and memory study that quickly turned into something else entirely. Participants were put into a pair with another volunteer. Random selection was used to identify who would be the learner and who would be the teacher. The participants were then split into 2 rooms. The teacher watching the learner be strapped into an electric chair and given a sample shock to prove that the chair was real. They were then split into their adjacent rooms, unable to see each other but connected through a microphone and the electrocution machine with the teacher at the controls. Under the watch of the experimenter, the teacher was instructed to read out strings of words to his partner, the learner, through the microphone in order for him to repeat them back. The teacher is told to administer an electric shock every time the learner makes a mistake, increasing the level of shock each time. There were 30 switches on the shock generator, voltage ranging from 15 volts, labelled slight shock, to 375 volts, labelled danger severe shock, and 450 volts, simply yet purposefully marked with XXX. Should the teacher refuse to administer the next level of shock, the experimenter was told to provide prompts or orders to the teacher to continue the experiment. Much like a Nazi soldier, if they showed hesitation whilst aiming down the barrel of the gun, they would be prompted to pull the trigger. Some people, horrified at what they were being asked to do, stopped the experiment early, defying the experimenter's urging to go on. Others continuing, and dealing what they thought to be a horrific pain towards the other participant, even with the sound of disturbing responses from the learner in the other room.
Let me out of here! Let me out of here!
Continue, please.
Ethics were brought into question regarding the stress endured by the participant administering the shocks. The fact that the pressure of hurting someone so badly or injuring them may result in post-traumatic stress disorder was something of great concern. No concern, however, for the learner actually getting shocked. Now this is due to the grand ruse. The experiment was fixed from the beginning. The random selection was not random at all. It would always result in the true target, the participant, becoming the teacher, as the learner was an actor. The study was not to look into the effects of memory, but of obedience to authority. The voltage the participant was actually inflicting was harmless, and the responses they heard from the room of the learner were pre-recorded. This deception was one of the controls of the study, to try and get a uniform and unbiased response, whilst also making sure no one was physically harmed in the process. Another control were the prompts that were used when a participant would contest the experiment. 4 prompts were used in order. Please continue. The experiment requires you to continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice but to continue. Ethics once again brought into consideration. Participants of psychological studies should be informed to clarity that they have a right to withdraw from the study. However, these final 2 prompts especially convey they don't have that right, and it would seem the pressure participants feel would become overwhelming and force them to do things they otherwise wouldn't have, once again causing great stress to the participant. However, my statement here is that if the true aim is to investigate obedience in relation to the Nazi soldiers, then do we doubt that the colonels of the SS would not have pressurized their soldiers to the same degree, if not greater so? And would this pressure not have to be replicated in the study to achieve a more accurate representation of the lengths that we're willing to go? Well, yes, it would, especially with the outcome. Scientists had estimated initially that 0.1% of participants would administer the full spectrum of shocks. However, Milgram was horrified by the actual results of the experiment. In the remote condition version of the experiment that I described, 65% of the subjects continued to inflict shocks right up to the 450 volt level, and 100% of the subjects went to at least 300 volts. This is all despite the learner's progressively more intense screams, complaints of a weak heart at the 180 volt level, at 300 volts the learner banging on the wall, protesting to leave, which was the exit point for only 35% of participants, and at the 330 volt level, disturbing silence, conveying lack of consciousness and even death. Moreover, once participants had continued and reached 450 volts, they obeyed the experimenter's instruction to deliver more 450 volt shocks when the subject continued to fail to respond. This was not the presupposition of the outcome of the experiment, and quite truly shocked the world, if you pardon the pun. Milgram drew his own conclusion stating this: the essence of obedience consists in the fact that a person comes to view himself as the instrument for carrying out another person's wishes, and he therefore no longer sees himself as responsible for his own actions. Once this critical shift of viewpoint has occurred in the person, all of the essential features of obedience follow. Thus, the major problem for the subject is to recapture control of his own regnant processes once he's already committed them to the purposes of the experimenter. Besides this, Milgram proposed the existence of other factors for why the subjects were so obedient: politeness, awkwardness of withdrawal, absorption in the technical aspects of the task, a belief that the experiment served a desirable end, the sequential nature of the action, and anxiety. Milgram's experiment became the subject of a host of moral and methodological critiques in the 1960s. Had the experiment happened about 10 years later, this would not have been entirely possible due to the publication of the American Psychological Association's Ethical Principles of Research with Human Subjects in 1973. God, that's a mouthful. And the restrictions on the use of human subjects included in the National Research Act of 1974, which effectively precluded psychologists from conducting experiments that, like Milgram's, were likely to cause serious distress to subjects. Nonetheless, can we also take the same conclusions Milgram did based on the small sample size and this one result? Multiple replications of his study show that the obedience rate does vary, some lower, but most of them typically coming in higher, such as a study reported in the 2012 European Review of Applied Psychology. J.L. Bouveau and colleagues on a French game show replicated Milgram's voice feedback condition, with identical props, instructions, responses, and prods. Now, one might question whether a game show host has as much authenticity as a scientific experimenter, but whatever authority, they managed to elicit levels of obedience equivalent to Milgram's original experiment, in fact, somewhat higher, 81% as opposed to the original 65% reached the highest setting. It would seem that at least French nationals are as compliant today as Milgram's original subjects in the 1960s. But the main thing we can conclude is this: humans are capable of a lot worse than we think. The environment we are subject to can influence our actions and in some cases make us do things that we would not do otherwise. We can also conclude that statistically, some of the Nazis would have had the same morality that you find in yourself today. But due to the strict political environment and being enrolled into the brutal regime, their obedience to authority had its part in some of the greatest atrocities the world has ever seen, and that maybe, without you knowing it, you are capable of the same. This is a new channel dedicated to psychological studies, theories, analyses, and deep dives, and much more to come. Subscribe, share, and like this to support the production of more videos.